Hey folks, so today we're going to talk about the Buddha and secular Buddhism. How might the Buddha have thought about secular Buddhism? Hey folks, so I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in helping to promote a wiser, a kinder, and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. We have talks like these roughly once a week on Mondays on topics having to do with early Buddhism, secular Buddhism, related philosophies. So today's discussion is going to be a little bit more speculative than some of the other ones. Speculative because we're talking about a subject that really never would have come up in the early texts. There were no secular Buddhists in the Buddha's day. Secular Buddhism is a modern concept. And so what we're going to do is to try to find some parallels, rough parallels within the Buddha's day, and try to see if we can extrapolate a little bit towards the future. So I think when we do this, the person we have to start with is the hair-shirted ascetic Ajita Kesakambali. Kesakambali means hair blanket. So he would have been a person, an ascetic, who went around wearing basically what we would call a hair shirt. And he was arguably, it's hard to know this for sure, but arguably the first recorded materialist in history, or certainly one of the first. He lived perhaps earlier than the Buddha, or around the time of the Buddha. That would have been 5th century BC. And the Buddha has various epithets or names for him. He calls him, depending on the text, he calls his view either nihilism or annihilationism. It's not entirely clear why the Buddha came up with these epithets, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So there are a couple of important suttas where the Buddha discusses Ajita Kesakambali's views. We'll start with the first one called the Apaṇṇaka Sutta, or the sutta on the sure bet. And this is an earlier reflection of an argument that we find very importantly in Western philosophy and Western theology called Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal was a French philosopher, theologian, who came up with this argument that he believed demonstrated that we should believe in God. And so the argument roughly goes like this. We should make a bet, right? Either we bet that God exists, or we bet that God doesn't exist. Okay, if we bet that God does exist, and God does in fact exist, then we get eternal life in heaven. If we bet that God does exist, and God does not, then, okay, we're spending a bit of extra time on Sundays going to church, which is a kind of a waste of time in that case, but, you know, it's not much. On the other hand, if we bet that God doesn't exist, and God does exist, then we go to hell, right? So we get a terrible, terrible kind of outcome. And if we bet that God doesn't exist, and he doesn't in fact exist, then, okay, we have a little bit of extra leisure time on Sundays. So the argument is that if you tote up all the bets here, you should come to the conclusion that belief in God is a reasonable bet. In fact, it's really the bet that we should make. Now, there are various very, very famous problems with this argument. I won't go into them here, although you can probably find them on the internet if you like. But I'll just say the first of those problems is that there's lots of bets like this that you can make, and it's not clear which one is better than which other one. So, for example, the Buddha's argument in the Apaṇṇaka Sutta against Ajita Kesakambali is basically make a bet. Okay, in this case, he's talking about rebirth. So he's saying, okay, look, Ajita Kesakambali is this materialist who does not believe in rebirth. He believes that all things are made out of material things. So either we bet that rebirth occurs, or we bet that it doesn't. So if we bet that rebirth occurs, then according to the Buddha, we're going to behave well. We're going to do good things. We're also going to be praised by the wise. The wise people out there are going to see us doing good things, and they're going to praise us for it. If rebirth really does occur, then we'll be reborn in a good state. On the other hand, if rebirth doesn't occur, we won't obviously be reborn, but at least we'll be doing good things, and the wise will be praising us. So that's nice. However, if we don't believe in rebirth, according to this text, we'll be prone to do nasty things. Because we'll be thinking, yeah, who cares? You know, we won't be reborn anyway, so, you know, just live a life for now and grab all we can for ourselves. Of course, the wise won't like that. If rebirth is true and we've bet that it isn't, then we're going to end up being reborn in a bad state. We're going to be reborn in one of the hells. And if we believe that rebirth isn't true, and rebirth actually isn't true, then, you know, we'll also be censured by the wise. who are not going to like us for what we do. The upshot from this argument, from this form of argument, just like with Pascal's, is whatever the case is, we should be believing in rebirth. In a second sutta called the Sandaka Sutta, the Buddha talks about Ajita Kesakambali, who is a renunciate, and says, look, if in fact there's no rebirth, if in fact all things are just material and we just decay into nothing when we die, then there's really no difference between somebody who practices assiduously for the ends that Kesakambali probably did, and somebody who just indulges in the whims of life, right? We're both going to the same end. We both end up rotting in the ground. Further, and here he seems to quote Kesakambali, at least we have to assume that that's an intended quote, that, quote, giving is a doctrine of fools. You know, what's the point in giving donations to worthies? What's the point in giving donations to the Sangha, to monastics? What's the point in giving money to the poor? If we're all going to die anyway, if we're not going to be reborn, if giving isn't going to get us a better outcome in a later life, then it's a doctrine of fools. Just keep the money for yourself, you know, just enjoy it yourself in this one life of yours. Now, before I get to some responses to these two suttas, let me just say a word about them. Neither the Apaṇṇaka nor the Sandaka Sutta have parallels in the Chinese agamas. And this is something of a concern because it may indicate that they come after the Buddha's lifetime. Now, it is true that both of them have at least fragmentary parallels in Sanskrit. So it's difficult to know what to make of that. It may be that they were created at a later time after some of the schools split apart. Some of them may have gone to China without these suttas because they came later. It's hard to know. But what is true is that Kesakambali and his view seem to have, occurred in many different suttas, not just these two. They're not really explained in quite as much detail in other suttas, but the details that are given are broadly the same. So I think although the precise arguments made in the Sandaka and Apaṇṇaka suttas may not go back to the Buddha, at the very least, they're broadly accurate. I think they're broadly indicative of what the Buddha might have said. Now, of course, okay, so some responses to these kinds of arguments. I think the main response has to be secular Buddhists of today are not nihilistic or annihilationistic in any important sense. By nihilistic, the Buddha really means Ajita Kesakambali seems to have denied ethical truths. He seems to have denied that certain kinds of acts were more skillful than other acts, that certain kinds of acts were ethically superior to other kinds of acts, and maybe he did believe that, but we don't have to believe that. Just because we are secular practitioners, just because we may suspend judgment about whether or not rebirth is true, doesn't mean that we reject ethical truths. We don't have to believe that giving is a doctrine of fools in order to believe in secular Buddhism. Now, the other epithet of being an annihilationist, Ajita Kesakambali seems to have believed in the annihilation of the self at death. That is to say, he may have believed in a permanent self, that is to say, a self that existed unchangingly during life, but that then was extinguished upon death. And again, we don't need to believe that either. Secular Buddhists can very well accept the Buddha's views on the self. Indeed, in a certain way, the notion of rebirth seems to argue for a stronger, a more coherent notion of self than the Buddha even is necessarily entitled to believe. The philosopher Derek Parfit, in his book Reasons and Persons, where he accepts a Buddhist notion of self, where the self is not really self-identical over time, but is simply a group of causally interconnected strands, says the same thing. He argues that, look, if rebirth were real, that would actually be an argument for a more permanent notion of self. The Buddha also says that the Ajita Kesakambali, or materialists, are annihilationist perhaps in the sense that they desire death, that they desire non-existence, in the same way that eternalists, that is to say the Brahmins who believed in eternal self, were desirous of eternal existence, of always existing, this kind of clinging to existence. So, you have clinging to existence on one extreme, and you have rejection of existence on the other. And so in that kind of schema, the materialists come out to be people who reject existence in some sense. And here again, secular Buddhists don't need to be rejecting existence to any important extent, or pushing it away, or desiring to not exist. So the overarching question here is, why do we have to assume that secularists or materialists have to be unethical? Ajita Kesakambali himself went around with a hair coat, which at least seems to indicate that he had a very strong ethical component. I mean, he was willing to undergo a lot of deprivations, presumably to some end that was, at least in his eyes, of moral purpose. We might also wonder whether it's ethically superior to engage in improper actions in order to get some future benefit in a future life, right? Or to avoid bad actions in order to avoid some future pain in a future life. Or whether it's better to engage in ethical actions simply because they're ethical, because they help other people here and now. In other words, is ethics sheerly prudential? Do we engage in ethical actions for our own prudential benefit, which seems rather selfish? Or do we engage in ethical actions because they help other people? And if we engage in ethical actions because they help other people and because they're the right thing to do, we can hold that whether or not rebirth occurs. Indeed, in his recent book on the Buddha's political and social ideas, the eminent monk Bhikkhu Bodhi argues that the Buddha did indeed have a place for people who did not believe in rebirth or didn't need to believe in rebirth, but nonetheless were ethical people. There are a couple of different suttas that he points to, one being the very famous Sutta to the Kālāmas, where the Buddha is talking to a bunch of non-Buddhists who really had no notion of his teachings and were very confused because a lot of different teachers came to their town and said different things. And they themselves didn't all believe in rebirth. And nonetheless, the Buddha does point out that even if you don't believe in rebirth, nevertheless, it's good to behave in ethical and in skillful ways to one another, not to create harm in the world. And similarly, in a different sutta where he has a talk to the householders of the bamboo gate, he argues in a way similar to the golden rule. He says, look, you don't want to be lied to, you don't want to be killed, you don't want to be harmed, you don't want to have stuff stolen from you, and so on. So why should you harm other people? Why should you lie to other people? Why should you kill other people? In other words, skillful behavior can be justified on its own grounds, simply in virtue of kindness and compassion towards other beings. That is to say, certain acts are unskillful because they create painful results for others and for ourselves. We don't like it when other people mistreat us, so we shouldn't mistreat others. These are arguments for ethical actions in the world that do not rely upon any kind of a belief in a rebirth or a future life. On this view, of course, justice is not guaranteed, right? I mean, the good thing, the clean thing, the positive thing about a rebirth kind of picture is that it holds out the possibility of perfect justice. It holds out the possibility that whatever you do will be perfectly compensated in a future life. Oh, and if you do good things, you'll get rewarded. And if something good happens to you, or I should say, if you do bad things in this life, you'll get punished for it. Now, of course, if these future states don't exist, we cannot be guaranteed of justice. Nevertheless, I think we all know good acts are also skillful acts. Bad acts, ethically wrong acts, are also unskillful acts. That is to say, that by acting ethically, we do make it more likely that we will get good results in the future. If for the very reason that other people around us are liable to think well of us, to think better of us if we are doing good things. So it's all really about right effort, about ethical action, about ethical thought, about non-attachment to our actions in the world. And for some people, a belief in rebirth may be skillful. I'm not going to say it isn't for everybody. For some people, it may be skillful, but I think we may need an argument that it's skillful for everybody. Now, the question I think that this leaves us with is, what would the Buddha have made of our argument now? Would the Buddha have agreed with us? Now, it's clear, I think, from the text that rebirth belief is a critical part of mundane right view. If you're interested to hear more about right view, I'll put a card up here. In fact, it's the first video in this series that I'm giving on the Eightfold Path, where we discuss the different aspects of right view. So to an extent, obviously, he wouldn't have agreed. I mean, he would have still thought that it was right view to believe in rebirth. Nevertheless, there is a very interesting text in the Saṃyutta Nikāya where the Buddha says that annihilationism is what he calls foremost among outsider or non-Buddhist views. Because, and I'll read here, annihilationists will not be unrepelled by existence and will not be repelled by the cessation of existence. That is to say, this kind of view of Ajita Kesakambali involves a kind of non-attachment to the world. Insofar as we see that we ourselves are material beings, or at least largely material beings, dependent upon a material world, that we have temporary lives, that change is everywhere around us, we're not going to be prone by this view to grasp at existence. In the same way, for instance, that a believer in an eternal soul might. A believer in an eternal soul might be repelled by the notion that cessation occurs. Of course, the Buddha's path, in a traditional sense, is heading towards this kind of cessation. Whereas an annihilationist, a materialist, and a follower of Ajita Kesakambali is not going to be repelled by the cessation of existence. They're going to say, look, existence ceases. Our own existence ceases in some sense after we die. So for these reasons, the Buddha seems to have believed that although Kesakambali's view wasn't right, it was as good as a view got that wasn't Buddhism. I tend to think that the reason it was really not Buddhism was because of this nihilistic aspect that he saw in it, that it rejected a kind of ethical picture of the world. So, the question remains, if we take this annihilationism and wed it to an ethical picture of the world, and again, I use the word annihilationism roughly because as I've just argued, it really doesn't have to be nihilationist in any important sense. That's getting us much, much, much closer. That's getting us to a position where I think we can begin to talk about a secular Buddhism. Further, I think it's important to note that a number of the Buddha's peers considered the Buddha to be an annihilationist because of his views on non-self. Now again, the Buddha would have rejected that. I mean, the Buddha did not consider himself an annihilationist because obviously there was no self to be annihilated, no permanent self. And as far as the conventional self goes, he didn't want to talk about that existing or not existing. The Buddha did not consider himself an annihilationist, but it's important to note in the texts, peers did consider him an annihilationist, probably because of the notion of cessation at parinibbana, that after an awakened person dies, well, I mean, of course, the Buddha doesn't answer the question of what happens at that point, but I think it's reasonable to assume that the Buddha's peers would have said, well, look, you just cease existing. So this has been obviously a speculative look at early Buddhism, at what the Buddha might have believed, at what he might say, or what the kinds of conversations we might have if the Buddha were alive today, talking about issues of secular Buddhism. And I think this is really about as far as we can push it, as far as I know to push it. We really don't have a final answer here. The Buddha was not a secular Buddhist in any important sense, but it's not entirely clear that he wouldn't have agreed that secular Buddhism was a viable kind of approach, a this-life approach to practice, a this-life approach to belief, but one that was ethically directed in the same way that the Buddha directed us to behave and act and to train our minds. And indeed, insofar as this secular Buddhist path is a path of non-attachment, it's not at all clear that a secular Buddhist couldn't reach the same actual end that the Buddha himself did in becoming awakened. Now, this would not probably be traditionally accepted, but I think if we look at the spirit rather than the letter of early Buddhist Dhamma, we will see that there's nothing within this secular path that I've been discussing that is incompatible with the kind of global non-attachment that is really the heart and content of awakening. Non-attachment to the world, non-attachment to the self, non-attachment to the aspects of the mind, non-attachment to our actions, non-attachment to past and future, which is a critical part of non-attachment within the Buddha Dhamma. So I hope that this has been helpful to you. And if it is, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. What we're truly trying to do here is to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stressful approach to reality, but one that doesn't require us to take on board speculative notions of supernatural states or future states of being that we may not all be comfortable with. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. And if you've been here before, then I'm really glad to have you back. Thanks so much for paying attention for this more lengthy and speculative chat today than maybe normal for us. And we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.